Welcome to Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and joining me tonight is Dale Brumfield. He is the author of a new book called Railroaded, the true stories of the first 100 people executed in Virginia's electric chair. Dale, thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Thank you for having me, Catherine. It's a pleasure.
Well, for regular listeners of the radio show, they will recognize your name and the fact that you have been a frequent guest on the show about a lot of different things. You are both an author, a cultural archaeologist, a historian. You've written 11 books, actually. And often the two of us discuss your work as field director for Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, VADP. And this book obviously comes out of an interest that you have in not just the death penalty, but the history of our penitentiary system in Virginia, your previous book being Virginia State Penitentiary, A Notorious History. So I found the book fascinating. I'm hoping our listeners will find our discussion tonight fascinating for the history of Virginian that even those of us who've lived here all of our lives do not know. And so let's start off by asking, what was the idea for this book, Railroaded?
Actually, the idea started, I was a late bloomer in grad school. I didn't go to grad school until I was 53 years old, graduated when I was 56 in 2015. And during that time, I got the opportunity to start researching and writing some short stories about, and some essays and some op-eds for the local papers on mass incarceration and capital punishment. This was before I even got involved with VADP. And in preparing these op-eds and these stories, I started researching some of the earlier executions to do, like you said, see where we've been and how we got where we are today. And then I did this research on the introduction of the electric chair, which happened in 1908. And it became a wholesale assembly line execution process during that point. And I also made a rather disturbing discovery that the state of Commonwealth of Virginia was actually using the electric chair as a form of electric lynching. Virginia's lynching numbers were very low during this period, but the execution numbers are very high. And so it's because the state was basically taking over the role of the lynch mobs by railroading these young black men into these sham trials and bogus convictions for such nonsense crimes as scaring a white schoolgirl. And a young man got executed for that. So doing all of that, I originally pitched that book, those stories of the first 100 executions, to Arcadia Publishing. We went back and forth, and finally they came back and said, well, we were looking for something else. Why don't you write the history of the penitentiary where all these executions occurred? So when a publisher makes a suggestion like that, you take it, right? Right. You're not going to say, no, I don't want to do that. So I did it, and I wrote the book, Virginia State Penitentiary, A Notorious History. Still, I was able to use a couple of those stories from Railroad in that penitentiary book, but I still had all of these stories that I had researched and written. So about just several months ago, I said, I need to do something with these stories. So I looked into it, and I talked to a publisher, talked to Ingram. These are published through an imprint of Ingram. And they said, you know what, the timing is perfect for this kind of book. Let's do it. So it happened. And then, and it was kind of a rush job, I'll admit. We were kind of taking advantage of the current perspectives of Black Lives Matter and some of the things going on, but in our criminal justice system. But it would seem like the perfect time to get the book out. And they wanted to get it out before the election, as did I. So here we are on September 7th, it came out. So that's where it happened. So luckily, the bulk of the research was done a few years ago.
It's funny
so
how
I just had to update and do some additions to it.
Well, I think that's very interesting because I am not a writer, and I am fascinated that you did get your MFA from the Virginia Commonwealth University in your 50s. Like, go you. And I'm sure it has like helped you hone your
Wow.
writing,
Yeah.
you know. But the fact of the matter is,
Absolutely.
these
Absolutely.
these stories were stories that you'd been working on, and you basically wrote a different book first, and then came back around to take the material that you had and rework it into a different format, a narrower story about who these first 100 people were. And to me, that's kind of just interesting from the perspective of how someone writes a book. And you've written 11, and I have written 0, so it's fascinating to me. I do like the format of the I do like the format of the book, Dale, because you actually do it in chronological order from the first Henry Smith all the way to the 100th person. And what's most interesting to
Right.
me is that's from 1908 until 1920. But what people need to understand is that 87 people were executed between 1908 and 1916. So the bulk of people,
Right.
were executed in 8 years. Like, do the math on that. That's
Yep.
incredible to me. And also in telling the stories, the individual stories, what you could find. And I am in awe of the fact that you did such deep research when, in some of these instances, especially when it was the black on black crime, it hardly got a mention in the newspaper or any background story on why this person was being
Right.
executed. So I like the format. I liked reading about each of these people, and
Right.
I think you've gone a long way to give dignity and humanity to these people who lost their lives. Many of them who were probably not guilty of anything. So my hat is
That's
off to
exactly
you.
right. And I was very acute. Well, thank you. I was acutely aware, and you'll notice the first sentence in the book is, to be clear, I am not saying these people are all innocent or they don't deserve some sort of punishment. I'm trying to head off the argument that I hear with VADP sometimes with people when I'm talking about the death penalty. They say, you care more about the killer than you do the victim. Well, that's of course, that's not true at all. And I did not want to give that impression in this book that in deference to the victims, I am playing up to the defendants, because that's simply the perpetrators. That simply is not the case. But the research is clear that many of these young, especially these young black men, were innocent, absolutely innocent. They were caught by mobs of white men who just might happen to find a young black man and say, he's the one. And then they take him before the victim. Oh, and sometimes it's a child, and that child has to walk out on the porch and identify them. And so here's a child walking out on a porch of a house with 50 angry white men holding a beat up young black man and saying, is this the one who did it? Now do the right thing. What they're going to say, yeah, that child is going to say yes. And boom, guess what? No legal counsel, into the 21-minute trial, 5-minute jury deliberation, off to the electric chair they go. So this happened time and time and time again. And one thing I wanted to make real sure of, Catherine, was I did not want to do a sampling of executions. Virginia has executed 1,390 people since 1608, number one in the nation. That's even more than Texas. I did not want to cherry pick 100 and put them out there, because you run the risk of people saying, oh, well, your political considerations, why you picked these, why did you pick this one over this one? And that's starting to apply some level of importance to each one. So I decided to pick just 100 right in a row, white, black, male, female, doesn't matter what the crime was, what anything was, because that is just such a window into the way the system was working at the time. And so I wanted to just blunt any criticism that could come out. They say the best way, you take away your enemy's ammunition. You never ask a question that you don't already know the answer, things like that. So I took away their ammunition by just doing these 100 in a row without any political consideration or bias of any kind.
Well, the format works really well. And for those of you who are just joining us, you're listening to Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. And tonight, my guest is Dale Brumfield. He is the author of a new book called Railroaded: The True Stories of the First 100 People Executed in Virginia's Electric Chair. And so of those 100 people, Dale, there were 99 men and there was one woman. And when I say one woman, she was hardly that, since she had just turned 17 the day before she was executed. And she was black. She was a
That's
black
correct.
Virginian. And
Yeah.
disproportionately for the percentage of the population in Virginia that is black, they are overrepresented in these 100 cases. And some of them, I was
By
struck by how
far.
many. Yeah, and I was struck by how many of them were teenagers. Teenagers. I mean, it's
Yeah.
horrifying to me.
16 and 17-year-olds.
Yeah.
Yep. Out of 100, 87 were black, 13 white, 99 men, one woman. And the story of the one woman is a very heart-wrenching story. Her name, ironically enough, is Virginia Christian. And she was a 16-year-old black teenage girl who worked for a white woman named Ida Belote. Mrs. Belote was considered to be the upper class of the Hampton, Newport News area. Her husband, she was a widow, but her husband had been a well-known grocery store owner. And she had hired Virginia to do some cleaning. And when Virginia came over, Mrs. Belote accused her of stealing a locket. And Virginia said, "No, I didn't. She said, I did not steal your locket." And a fight escalated. Ida Belote threw a ceramic cuspidor or a spittoon at Virginia, striking her and shattering it. Virginia, basically in defending herself, wound up killing Mrs. Belote with stuffing a rag in her mouth to stop her from screaming and pushing it down with a broom handle and suffocated her. Now, the second tragedy in this case was the fact that when Virginia went on trial, she had two black attorneys who were both graduates of Howard University, and they would not call her on the stand because they thought she was too uncouth and had a poor way of speaking and would not do herself any good. But what happened was, too, behind the scenes, was law enforcement was saying that if Virginia Christian is found innocent, the lynch mobs are going to kill not just her, but every black in her neighborhood. So that was a strong motivation for the jury to find her not only guilty, but to sentence her to death, to make sure that to head off the lynch mobs, because lynch mobs had a way of driving criminal justice back in those days. Very tragic story all the way around.
It was. And you give some background actually that her mother was in a wheelchair and hesitated to send her daughter over there because this woman had a reputation for being mean and abusive. But she did
Exactly.
send her over there, and this is the tragedy that resulted. And you're so right too that the lynch mobs still dictated justice, because oftentimes the sheriffs, when they picked these accused people up, they had a choice. Either they could confess immediately, or they could say that they were not guilty, and the lynch mobs would come after them. I mean, it was not really a choice at all. It just wasn't a choice at all. I mean, either the courts were gonna ram through your case, some of them literally in a matter of 24 hours, or the lynch mobs were gonna kill you anyway.
Exactly. So there was no choice. I mean, these young blacks found themselves in this situation where death was the only option that they had. Either it was go to the electric chair or be lynched. So just imagine being in a situation like that. I found a lot in my research. I found a lot of these young blacks who were arrested. The newspaper report would say they first denied their guilt, but soon made a complete confession. I read that a lot. I thought, wait a minute, are they really confessing? What are they confessing to? Why are they confessing? Anyone who knows criminal justice during the Jim Crow era will know that the police put them in a situation where they had no choice but to confess and take their chances in the courtroom, because they certainly couldn't be found innocent or claim innocence. They couldn't even claim innocence because for fear of the threatened lynch mobs. So it was a horrifying situation for them, for sure.
It was. And for those of you who are just tuning in, this is Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and I am talking with Dale Brumfield. He is the author of a new book called Railroaded, and it really gives a profile of the first 100 people that were executed in Virginia's electric chair, which, by the way, was installed in 1908. So let's talk a little bit about Virginia's fascination with the electric chair, which was actually put on display at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. For those of you who know about that particular World's Fair, that chair came from Sing Sing in New York. And there was a particular issue in Virginia because executions had been previously done by hanging. And because so many of the people being hung were Black, it created this atmosphere. I would call it sort of a homegoing celebration by the Black community to send off. Yeah, it was a
That's
homegoing.
a good word for it.
It was a homegoing celebration, and so there was a festival, carnival-like atmosphere. And the convicted, before they were hung, got a platform to speak to their community. And there were a lot of people in the criminal justice and law enforcement and in the judicial branches who didn't like that spectacle. So explain a little bit about what the novelty of this electric chair actually meant for reducing what
Sure. Yeah. Well, they were known at the time as Carnivals of Death. A Carnival of Death was these gallows, these executions at the gallows with these young Black men, and they drew huge crowds. There's one in particular in New Kent County in the 1890s that drew about 2,000 or 3,000 people. And the sheriffs would give these young Black men a chance to speak. And for the first time in their lives, they were able to stand up, and they were seen almost as a prophet. They're on their way to the promised land. You know, these crowds gathered not to condemn their transgressions or their crimes. They gathered to praise their entry into heaven. And so that's why all this chanting and swaying and praying was happening. Well, the General Assembly got wind of these things, and they said, you know, we got to stop these carnivals of death. And in the 1897, they introduced the first secrecy law that they still did hangings, but they built a wall or hung a curtain or something around the actual gallows so people could not actually see the hanging. The only thing is, people would climb up on top of the walls, or they'd stand on a hill, like in the case with the penitentiary in Richmond. They just stand on the hill across the road and look right down at the hanging. So that was a pretty toothless law. But in 1908, the Adams Electric Company from New Jersey, Trenton, New Jersey, came around and said, we've installed 4 electric chairs in 4 other states. We'd love you to take a look at doing that in Virginia. Well, the progressive reformers at the time thought that the electric chair would be a more humane form of capital punishment, whereas the Jim Crow segregationists saw it as a way to stop gatherings of Black people. We need to stop Blacks from congregating and partying and praying and having a good time. It gave them complete control over the lives and now the deaths of the Black citizens. So they saw the electric chair. They're taking capital punishment from a field with a party into a dark basement where a Black is not surrounded by their peers, but by 10 or 12 somber white men who are going to witness it. It was seen as a way of inspiring terror in the heart of the superstitious African, was how the Richmond Times-Dispatch described it. So it was a way of, you know, it was seen that way. It was seen as like lynching in that respect, in that it was inspiring terror in the heart of the superstitious African. There's absolutely no difference between the two. So once they installed the electric chair, they had $6,000. That's what the cost was. They didn't have enough money to actually buy the chair itself. The money they used went to wire the chair and create the electric plant. The actual wooden chair was built by inmates using a picture of a chair at Sing Sing prison, the one that was on display in Chicago in 1893. And they built the chair that looked exactly like the one from Sing Sing. So, and then the first execution in that chair occurred in October of 1908. So it didn't take them any time at all. From February until October of 1908, They approved the electric chair, got it built, installed, wired up, and executed their first prisoner.
Yeah, they did it in pretty short order, and in many ways it did what it was intended to do, in that it cut off the spectacle of these executions. What was interesting to me that you brought up in the book is that those who were executed for a capital crime in the electric chair could actually be claimed by their family members at their family's own cost,
Right.
to return the body. But every other general
Right.
population prisoner just went to a medical school for dissection. Like, there was no returning prisoners who died to their families, which is, to me, crazy.
It's a weird law, and I don't know why it was instituted that way. But yes, if a capital prisoner was executed in the chair, then the family could pay to have the body shipped back to their hometown for burial. If not, it just went to the Medical College of Virginia dissecting lab for students to study. So yeah, it was a very strange law, and I don't understand exactly why it was in place that way.
Yeah, I mean, and these are some of the things that you bring out in your book that I just think people have no idea, because why would anybody have any idea about this? But the fact that you couldn't get back a prisoner's body after they died, just like of natural causes in prison, it's just the depth of inhumanity all the way around is breathtaking to me. And it's one of the reasons I think people should be interested in reading this book, because I think many people don't understand how we got to the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, when in fact it's been hundreds and hundreds of years in the making, particularly in Virginia, when protesters poured out into the streets of Richmond night after night after night and just would not relent. The inhumanity is striking to me when you read the cases, the profiles of these 100 people, and basically the history of capital punishment in Virginia. And of course, your work is there. You are a field director for VADP, and this is what VADP has been taking on for decades.
It's a matter of legacy. And if you look, the legacy of capital punishment comes out of this book and everything that happened for 300 years prior to that. But usually in Virginia, we usually have to be dragged kicking and screaming from any legacy. From slavery, we had slavery. We got dragged kicking and screaming from that. We had lynching, dragged from that. We had eugenics, had to be dragged out and stop doing eugenics. And now we have capital punishment. And we know every statistic is there, says capital punishment is not a cost-effective form of deterrence. It is racially biased. It is innocent people get caught up in it. It needs to end, but yet we still cling to it. So I just find that dumbfounding that we would still cling to something that is rooted in such egregious, racially biased behavior. But we still cling to it, thinking that we're doing it better than we used to do it. We don't do those things anymore. Well, guess what? You're still in Virginia today 7 times more likely to be executed if you're Black than you are a white for the exact same crime. You are 3 times more likely to be executed in Virginia today if your victim is white rather than if your victim is Black. So these types of disparities are still with us, and they're rooted in this 350, 400 years of legacy that we just can't let go of.
Well, you do an excellent job of really pointing out the difference between Black on white crime versus Black on Black crime. And another footnote that was just unbelievable to me is that Blacks could not testify against a white perpetrator for years, which meant that Black women who were raped were not in a position of testifying against their accuser. So white men who clearly perpetrated assaults on Black women for hundreds of years in the Commonwealth of Virginia were pretty much protected by the fact that their victims could not testify them legally, were prohibited from testifying against them. That is crazy.
It's horrible. And as late as 1950, when I was studying the Martinsville 7 case, which is not in railroaded, but it is in the Virginia State Penitentiary book, when 7 black men were executed, 4 in one day, 3 on another day, for the rape and attempted rape of a white woman. That led me to look into, well, what did white men who were accused and found guilty of raping black women, what was their punishment? Well, I found one farmer in rural Virginia raped a mentally disabled young black woman and got fined $20.
That is agreed.
That was his punishment for raping a black woman. It is absolutely horrific. And there's a case in the book where I mentioned, I have an illustration in Railroaded from the Richmond Planet that occurred in, I think, 1894, 1895, where a white man actually killed a black man in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and was fined $10. So,
yeah.
Believe it or not, in Virginia, not one white person was executed for killing a black person until 1996, and only 3 more since then. That is an astonishing statistic. There was no white on black executions until 1996.
And that's the story the data tells. And that's when we come back from our break, I want to go into the specifics of some of the people that you profiled. But data tells the story about patterns and practices of injustice. So please join us after this break. You're listening to Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax.
Radio Fairfax. What you want to hear, where you want to hear it.
Hi, I'm Marianne Metz from The Melody Lingers On Radio Fairfax. Join me in exploring and enjoying the Great American Songbook. We bring back the wonderful voices of Rosemary Clooney, Bing Crosby, Ella Fitzgerald, Judy Garland, and Frank Sinatra, just to name a few. And we hear some who are still singing for us today. So come listen as the melody lingers on.
The Melody Lingers On every Wednesday at 11 a.m. only on Radio Fairfax.
Join Mike Delaney Wednesday evenings at 9 for a weekly meeting with the chairman of the board, a true American Idol, Mr. Francis Albert Sinatra. That's Simply Sinatra, Wednesday nights at 9 only on Radio Fairfax.
A message to help keep you safe. If doctors told us today that we'd made a breakthrough on COVID-19, saving thousands of lives, we would rejoice. Finally, a good news day. We'd feel less afraid that our loved ones would be struck by the invisible enemy. We'd start to feel hope that we could live our lives again. Well, a mask does all that. We can help protect others by covering our noses and mouths, which is how the virus mainly spreads. Masks are a ticket to freedom, to be out in the world, to getting together, back to work, back to doing what we want. If doctors announced we could save lives today, we would grab that breakthrough with both hands. While we wait for a vaccine, grab the breakthrough that's already here. When we're out, it's masks on.
Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Okay, men, this is your time. Maybe you didn't choose this, but you're here now. You're gonna go out there and be an all-star caregiver. Cook, clean, be there emotionally and physically. You gotta dig deeper. Drive them to physical therapy, doctor's appointments, because that's what caregivers do. Don't give up. Show the world that you're tougher than tough. Caregiving is tougher than tough. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving. Brought to you by AARP and the Ad Council.
Wake up and text. Text and eat. Text and meet up with a friend you haven't seen in forever.
Hi.
Oh, hey. Text and complain that they're on their phone the whole time. Text and listen to them complain that you're on your phone the whole time. Text and whatever. But when you get behind the wheel, give your phone to a passenger. Put it in the glove box. Just don't text and drive. Visit StopTextsStopWrecks.org. A message from NHTSA and the Ad Council.
Social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Welcome back to Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and joining me tonight is Dale Brumfield. He is the author of 11 books, the newest one being Railroaded, the true stories of the first 100 people executed in Virginia's electric chair. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us tonight, Dale.
Thank you for having me, Catherine. It's a pleasure.
So the first person executed in the chair was 1908. His name was Henry Smith. And interestingly enough, he wasn't the only Henry Smith in your book who was executed. And it's interesting about names because one of the things that struck me is that so many of the surnames of the people who were executed are old Virginia family names. Because, of course, they were descendants of the enslaved African Americans in Virginia. And so their identity was actually the family names of the families who enslaved them, which is remarkable, really, to think about how identity has been stripped away from so many Black Virginians. It's unbelievable. So there were two Henry Smiths, and the first one was in 1908. The other one, Henry Smith, was convicted of killing a Chicago artist named Schultz. And I found
Correct.
your profile of that Henry Smith particularly interesting because as you're describing how they were trying to track down who might have killed this white artist from Chicago, there's kind of this sentence that says a business card was found in his pocket for J.A. Birch, but they couldn't question J.A. Birch because mysteriously he had committed suicide the week after for reasons unknown. I'm thinking, well, gosh, that's kind of a
Exactly.
red flag. I'm like, what?
That case was very mysterious in a lot of ways, and it was so well covered by the press because it was a black on white crime. They had 4 Black men accused of killing this white artist from Chicago, and I think the air of mystery around the victim is what really drove the press coverage of that particular case. It happened in Alexandria, right down the road from you, and and Henry Smith was a previous inmate at the state penitentiary. He had served a brief stint at the penitentiary a few years earlier for robbery, I believe, robbed a jeweler. And I think police found him to be an easy mark as a former inmate. And they caught him on a bogus charge and put him in jail and held him for 4 days with no food or water to extract a confession, which they eventually did. And he supposedly implicated 3 other Black men that he knew. And so the 4 of them went, and all 4 of them originally received death sentences, but it turned out Henry was the only one who actually got killed. The case got so muddy and so complicated that there was real question, real doubt whether any one of them even committed any crime. But public pressure on the police was so intense that they had to catch and punish somebody. And that somebody happened to be Henry Smith.
You know, and there were so many profiles. Like I said, reading the profiles, some of them are quite short because there's just not a lot of information that you could even find. But some of them are quite interesting.
Right.
And 2 of the most interesting ones are actually not about Black men who were executed, but about 2 very prominent white families. There was Henry Clay Beatty Jr. in 1911 in Richmond, and then the Allen family in Hillsville. But let's start with Henry Clay Beatty Jr. I mean, the audacity, seriously, of him trying to pull off the murder of his wife. Tell us a little bit about
Henry was a son of a Henry was the son of a very prominent Richmond businessman, Henry Beatty Sr. And Henry was a spoiled and irresponsible kid, just a punk of a kid, good for nothing, ne'er-do-well, living off his father's wealth, no career path and no nothing. And he got married, but after he got married, he married a very prominent Northern Connecticut woman, I believe, Louise Welford Owen was her name. And while he was married to her, he discovered this 13-year-old female named Beulah Binford. And Beulah, quote, had a reputation for being fast at age 13. And so Henry started an affair with Beulah. They separated briefly, but they got back together. He paid for her to live in Richmond in an apartment. And then Henry pretty much decided that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with Beulah Binford. So he concocted the murder of his wife. He took her for a ride in a car and shot her in the face with a shotgun, and then threw the gun out and claimed that a man with a long beard had committed the act. And but it didn't take the police long to figure out that Henry wasn't telling the truth. But Henry cut his own throat because he was imperturbable. They said, this guy is too cold. He's just not reacting the way a normal person would react in a case like this. And he just was, I think he really assumed, he said, I'll never go to the electric chair. He said that. He goes, they'll never convict me or send me to the electric chair. Well, they did. And it's very unusual for a wealthy white man to actually go to the electric chair. It's actually unheard of. And Henry was the last wealthy white man to be executed in Virginia in 1911. He was probably the first also, but the case is just, but I think it was his attitude that convinced the jury that this wealthy white man needed to be put to death, because he just had no remorse. He lied constantly about everything, and he just basically did his own self in.
Well, that was certainly one of the more fascinating profiles, but it also showed that even, he was convicted of a capital crime, and he did go to the electric chair. But as you said, the last wealthy man to do so. For those of you who are just joining us, this is Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and joining me tonight is Dale Brumfield, who is the author of a new book called Railroaded: The True Stories of the First 100 People Executed in Virginia's Electric Chair. The second high-profile case that struck me, and I had never heard of this case before, is of the Allen family. Floyd Allen, his son Claude, went to the electric chair, but other members of their family did not go to the electric chair, even though they gunned down a judge, a Commonwealth's attorney, a sheriff, a juror in a courtroom in plain sight. The father and son were eventually executed, but not until hundreds of thousands of Virginians petitioned the governor to commute their sentences. Oh, please do tell us the background on this one, Dale.
That one was that's quite a case, and it is still a bone of contention with many longtime Hillsville, Virginia residents. It was seen as a political case, the Democrats versus the Republicans. In this case, Floyd Allen and Claude they basically ran the town, but they weren't uneducated mountaineers. Claude Allen, the younger one, actually had 2 years of business school, so they weren't the rough and tumble. They were rough characters, but they weren't stupid by any stretch. But they basically ran the show. And Floyd Allen was arrested for a pretty minor crime. He stopped two Hillsville policemen from arresting his two nephews who were creating a disturbance at a church meeting. And so he actually chased one of the policemen completely out of town. And so he was charged with interrupting with a policeman in the line of their duties, and he went to court. Now, when they went to court, he swore, "I will not go to prison." I don't know if Floyd Allen was scared of prison or what the problem was, but he vowed he would not be taken to prison under any circumstances. And so he probably felt he could bully the judge and the jury like he usually did. He was able to get away with these minor crimes because he would just simply bully his way through them. So the day of the trial, they had the entire family show up, and they allowed them to carry guns into the courtroom. I still, to my dying day, will wonder why that happened, but they did. Even extra belts of ammunition, they just came in fully loaded with gunfire. And then they found Floyd Allen guilty, and the jury sentenced him to 2 years in the penitentiary. And Floyd stood up and he said, "Judge, if you affirm that sentence, I will kill you." And the judge would not be swayed. And he said, "Well, I uphold the jury. I sentence you to 2 years in the penitentiary." And Floyd Allen said, "Judge, I ain't a-going." And all of a sudden, the whole courtroom erupted in a fusillade of gunfire. All the Allens stood up and started shooting. The court officers had guns on them too. They started shooting back. It was a cataclysm of gunfire and smoke and noise inside of this courtroom. And the judge was killed. Although the judge said Floyd Allen did not kill him. The judge said that Sidney Allen, one of the nephews, actually killed him. The Commonwealth's attorney was killed. The sheriff was killed. 2 jurors were killed. There were a total of 5 deaths, numerous injuries. They even spilled out onto the street, shooting at each other. The clerk of court, this guy named Dexter Goad, he had been shot in the neck, but he was still blazing away at the Allens. Floyd was shot, injured. He went to the hotel there in Hillsville where he was arrested the next morning. Claude got away. The nephews got away. And the governor, instead of sending a militia to Hillsville, he hired the Baldwin Felts Detective Company to go looking for these people. And they eventually caught them all. And Floyd and Claude were both sentenced to death in the electric chair. But the two of the nephews, Wesley Edwards, Sidney Allen, and Friel Allen, just got penitentiary terms. I know Wesley Edwards served about 15 years before he was let out and started a restaurant in North Richmond. So again, it was seen more as a political, and today it's still political. If you look at Floyd and Claude Allen's headstone in Hillsville, it reads that he was murdered by the Commonwealth of Virginia. Very upfront with the fact that Virginia killed Floyd and Claude Allen in a political move. So fascinating story down in Hillsville, Virginia.
It really is. And I have to say, Friel Allen is the one who killed the Commonwealth's attorney and was sentenced to 18 years. 18 years for,
that's correct,
in front of eyewitnesses, gunning down the Commonwealth's attorney in court. You know, when you talk about a 2-tier system of justice,
exactly right.
And then you look at, and I was so impressed that these thousands of white Virginians who pleaded to the governor to commute their sentences instead of electrocuting them. It was the Washington and Lee Law School, the UVA Law School, women's clubs. I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. It's just incredible.
Yeah, that's just how political it was. The whole thing was so political at the time. It was unbelievable for that period of time to think that the politics could be that powerful in a small town like that.
And Hillsville I know well because that's in Carroll County, and I was born in Galax, which straddles Grayson County and Carroll County.
Boy.
So I know that area of the Commonwealth very well. For people who are like, where is Hillsville? It's in the southern tip of the Commonwealth of Virginia. But it does show that there were incredible disparities. And one of the sad cases is the man who was a teenager who was killed for robbing or being accused of robbing a white boy of $11. The capital crimes were supposed to be, there was a very narrow definition of who was eligible for capital punishment. And yet time and time again, that was bent. And they made all kinds of exceptions where in this case, this young man who was a child and was robbed of his $11 grew up to live a very long, productive life, and the teenager who he accused of accosting him was put to death.
Yep. Yeah, it certainly was. And, it's part of the code of Virginia at the time. And, once again, it was always the threat of, I was astonished at the threat of lynch mobs. We think of Virginia as not being a big lynching state, and it wasn't. But the presence of lynch mobs was constant during these cases. And especially if there's a black on white crime, they were moving these prisoners around to different prisons to avoid lynch mobs and this type of thing. And really, they used it as an excuse. There was one episode in 1894, the laws were rewritten in Virginia for attempted rape. And they decided to make attempted rape a capital crime for black men because they worried that if they didn't, the lynch mobs would do it for them. So they went ahead, capitulated to the lynch mob by making attempted rape a capital crime for blacks, when for whites, of course, it was not. So yeah, talk about two-tier, and it was stark, and it was in your face, two-tier criminal justice. There's no getting around it.
And I think there are a lot of people who would claim that exists today, if you look at the data. For those of you who are just joining us, you're listening to Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight we're talking with Dale Brumfield, author of 11 books, his most recent being Railroaded, the true stories of the first 100 people executed in Virginia's electric chair. So when we talked about the fact that 87 people were killed in the first 8 years of having the electric chair, it did start to slow down, which because your book is written in chronological order of profiles, one profile after the other. You see it start to slow down a little bit as you get like into the late teens. I don't know if that was because of World War I. There was an influenza epidemic going on at the time. There was just a lot of things going on. I don't know if you have a theory about why after this huge number in the first 8 years, it kind of slowed down somewhat.
No, I think you pretty much hit two of the big reasons right there. World War I and the influenza epidemic starting in 1917, 1918 greatly slowed things down. I found no other circumstances that could describe why they slowed down. So I don't know why, because it ebbs and it flows. If you look at the history of capital punishment in Virginia, you'll see a decade where they skyrocket and then they go down to nothing. Here lately, the 1990s was the most prominent decade for executions. We were killing, I forget how many we killed in the 1990s. We did 19 in 1 year. In 1998, I think 1996 or 1997. But so it comes and it goes. Now we haven't had one in Virginia now for 3 years, so we've bottomed out. We've hit a very low point right now. So, and hopefully it'll stay that way. But for the last 400 years, it's been very highs and very lows.
Well, and that goes back to the work that you're doing for Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty too. VADP has worked diligently and relentlessly to bring these issues up with communities all over the Commonwealth of Virginia, and why this practice not only is not a deterrent to criminals or crime, but the fact that it is perpetrating an injustice, a clear injustice, which your book, just in profiling 100 people chronologically, as you said, not cherry picking cases. You basically said, let's take a look at these 100 and who they were and what the crimes were and how it all shook out. And I think that was a good way of being objective in telling the stories of the fact that capital punishment is itself an injustice. It is a crime. There's nothing to be gained from it. And the work that VADP has been doing, I think, has probably helped to slow down the number of capital cases that have come before the courts recently. That and the fact that it takes a lot of time and money and effort to actually prosecute a capital case as opposed to a non-capital case. And that wasn't the case in this era that you were talking about, 1908 to 1920. The weight was not as heavy in a capital case as what we're seeing now. So help us to understand that a little bit too.
Yeah, the cost certainly was not a consideration during this era, but fairness was certainly not a consideration either. We found case after case after case of these, especially these young blacks, brought in. The case of Clifton Breckenridge in Stanton, Virginia, sticks out in my mind because he was already a prisoner in the Stanton jail. He was a trustee in the jail, and he was accused of assaulting the 6-year-old daughter of the jailer when he was cleaning the residence behind the jail. And he confessed to the crime on November 5th to another inmate. The inmate snitched on him, and then the very next day, on November 6th, I think this was 1912 or 1913, the very next day, they indicted him at 11 a.m., and then at 2 o'clock, the trial started. At 3:15, the jury went out. At 3:20, the jury came back with death in the electric chair. And then 31 days later, he was dead in the electric chair. 30 days, had to separate sentencing from execution during that time, 30 days. So on the 31st day, he was executed. Look at the speed. I mean, this is lynching. Today, the Supreme Court in 1974 instituted several standards that have to be met for capital cases when the death penalty is on the table. And that includes a thorough appeals process. So this is where we start seeing appeals carrying on for 30 years. But then again, today, 70% of all the outrageous costs of a death sentence are incurred at the trial level. The Supreme Court mandated 2 trials, a guilt or innocence trial and then a sentencing trial. Both of them eat up enormous amounts of resources. They're crazy expensive, and it costs anywhere from 3 times more than a non-capital crime in Virginia to up to 50 times more than a non-capital crime in a state like California. So if you're talking about taxpayer dollars, you're much more fiscally responsible by putting someone in prison without the possibility of parole for the rest of their lives, because that is far cheaper than even pursuing a death sentence against someone, because of the Supreme Court mandates that were put in place in the 1970s that must be adhered to today. So there's really no comparison cost-wise from then and now.
Well, and I think that's one of the significant reasons that we have seen a slowdown. For those of you who are just joining us, you're listening to Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and I am talking with Dale Brumfield, who is the author of Railroaded. So here in the last minutes of the show, Dale, I want to give you an opportunity to kind of reflect back on writing this book, researching this, and how you felt about it once it was all done. I'm assuming that when you research a person, when you try to get to know their background, their family, their circumstances, there's a connection there, reaching back over years to try to understand what kind of lives they actually led.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I thought a lot of people have said to me, it must have been a very painful book to work on, especially, you've got in Virginia's history, we have executed many children. We executed a 12-year-old in 1787 and a 13-year-old the very next year. It's another dubious record that Virginia holds of executing the youngest person ever. You have these cases like that. You see these young people who are brought in, they're mentally ill, they're desperately poor, they didn't have a chance. But one thing I started doing early on was I started putting up kind of a wall between me and them. And I had to. The subject matter gets too dark sometimes. And if you get emotionally involved in every single case, I wouldn't be able to complete the book. And I really did start to put a wall up. But when the book was done, I guess you could say I had my good cry, because it was like, all of a sudden, it's like, wow, this just comes pouring out. But while I worked on the penitentiary book, and while I worked on this one, it was like, get the book, get the profile, move to the next one, keep going, keep going, keep going. And I didn't give myself time to start reflecting on or getting emotionally attached or involved to some of these. Now, some of them, of course, I did. You've got a 16-year-old mentally ill young person who is just trying to steal food or trying to find something to eat, or just thrown into this impossible situation, you can't help but feel like, what an awful injustice. So my point was, okay, I couldn't stop what happened to these people back then, but I can stop it from happening in the future. Come hell or high water, I'm going to keep working at stopping it from happening again. And I think that's what we all have to do when we're looking at criminal justice. Can't fix the past, but we can fix the future.
I think that's so important, and why it's so important that you're motivated to research and write these books, because we can't understand how we got there until we understand, our own history, which we haven't been taught in school. I mean, so many Virginians would be appalled and at the same time enlightened by the book that you've written, because it explains so much the pent up rage over the killings of unarmed Black people. And when you talk about, George Floyd was an awful case that ignited the protest this summer, but Breonna Taylor, even worse.
Right.
She was sleeping in her own bed, in her own home, and no one's held accountable. And how we can talk about justice and brush this aside as if it's acceptable, I think in this country it's not acceptable. And I hope your research, your history, your book will motivate the next generation to intentionally say, this is not an American value, this is not human rights, it's not civil rights, and it's got to stop.
Exactly. I keep thinking, is there a sequel, or is there something? What do you do moving forward? And I think I don't know. The Breonna Taylor case, and another thing about that really is listening to people try to justify what happens to these young Black people. You read online that people say, well, in the Breonna Taylor case, this is what she gets for hanging out with a known drug dealer. I hear people say these things, and I say, how can you say that? How can you say, the man shot 7 times in the back, Jacob? How can you say, well, he was going for a knife in his car? No, he doesn't deserve to get killed for that. That's police acting as judge, jury, and executioner. He deserves a trial. I don't care what he's accused of. Everybody deserves a trial.
And those are great. Those are great final thoughts, Dale. We look forward to your next book. People can find you online. And that's our show for tonight. Making Change Radio is on Radio Fairfax every Thursday at 9 p.m.